Okay. So, moving on, Dr. Lockard.
Okay, board members, as I know you're well aware, the Risk Committee was appointed in February, given parameters and direction to work independently with a timeline for reporting at the September 2018 Board of Education meeting, which is tonight. That process has occurred, and it's been done in public meetings as was designed. Dr. David Lever, who was appointed as the facilitator, and the members of the community, of the committee, have worked incredibly diligently to digest very complex matters, formalize options in the report that will be presented this evening. This is not an easy process or an easy task, easy subject matter. For my part, I really want to thank Dr. Lever and all of the members, many of whom are with us this evening, for your time and your commitment in working on this effort and bringing back to us the report. I think you'll all agree that their work is reflected in this very comprehensive and thorough report. So I say thank you to you for your work there. And at this point, I'll turn things over to Dr. Lever.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lockhart. Good evening, members of the board. First of all, I'd like to thank you for appointing me in the first place as facilitator. This has been an extremely gratifying and interesting process that I've gone through. I also want to compliment you on your good judgment in the appointments that you made of the members. It was because of them that the discussions were extremely lively. They brought a great deal of their own experience and their observations to the table, contributed enormously to the richness of the options that we looked at, also assisted me tremendously in developing the reports and the presentation with their feedback. And I also want to thank you for the support that you gave through the staff. The staff has been extraordinarily responsive to requests for information, for updates. I've worked with many school systems, and I have to say, the staff here gets very, very high marks for what they've done. The accuracy, the quickness of response are really very encouraging. This evening, we'd like to give you a rundown of important topics. I'd like to cover 4 topics. The background factors that were considered by the Risk Committee in developing their options, basic findings that they came to that oriented their work, the planning process itself, and then the heart of the matter is the planning options. There are maps at the end of the presentation. I won't be speaking to those unless they come up in discussion, and you might want to, would like to refer to them. So first of all, in terms of background factors, I think that you're probably familiar with most of this, but I just want to lay out what it was that the committee was looking at. Enrollment projections for the coming years. The 2017 enrollments appear to have stabilized after a long period of decline. The projections to 2027, it appears that elementary school enrollments will increase. Live births have increased in the past 3 years, and that speaks well for kindergarten enrollments and then subsequent enrollments in elementary school. Middle school enrollments will decline slightly and then increase, and then high school enrollments will decline. And I think what you're seeing here is the roll-through of an increase in the live births, kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, and then eventually it should show up in high school. The 10-year projection is that the enrollments will be stable at about 25,000 students. Maryland Department of Planning's demographic figures indicate that the total county population will increase by about 12.5% between 2015 and 2040. The population will become proportionally older. Population under 45 will increase at about the same proportion as the population as a whole. The population in the mature employment years, 45 to 64, is projected to decrease by about 23%, while the population 65 and older, which would also include retirees, is projected to increase rather dramatically by 86%, and the total percentage of the population will increase. This has important implications in the long run, I think, for the kind of support that the Board of Education, the school system, will receive from the general population. Continuing on, what did I just do? Oh, there it is, okay. Continuing on background factors. Facility utilization right now is at the low end of the parameters that you gave us back in March, marginally at 87%. And the range between 70% on the low end and 102% on the upper end, generally by industry standards, that's acceptable. They can both be worked with. Neither of them of those extremes, and there is no school in the system which can't deliver the basic educational program because of extreme underutilization or extreme overutilization. That's not to say that there aren't specific problems that emerge, and there are examples of these. Underutilization might mean in a high school situation that not all electives can be offered that the students might want, or if they are offered, not as many sessions can be offered as the students might need. If school is overutilized, a very familiar problem is excessive use of the cafeteria, too many lunch sessions. Lunch begins too early, it ends too late. You might have overlapping sessions. These are very common problems around the state when you see overutilization. They can be handled, however. The projected utilization for 5 years out, 2022, is 86%. It goes down just below the board's parameter. However, the highest projected utilization goes to about 112% at Freedom Elementary School, which by anybody's standard is overutilized. And the lowest projected utilization goes to 65% at South Carroll High, which is also underutilized. So you're beginning to see more of a spread between the highest and the lowest utilization, and those will have to be addressed. Generally, what you're seeing, and the chart at the bottom shows this, is that the number of schools that are overutilized will tend to decrease. The schools that meet the board parameter will increase slightly, and the schools that are below the board's utilization parameter will also increase slightly. And that reflects the general decrease in the overall utilization. Another factor looked at was the age and condition of facilities. Carroll County Public Schools has the 14th oldest average square footage in the state. The facilities are extremely well maintained. They regularly get scores of good and superior on the state inspection reports. And I think what was said earlier about the cleanliness, that's my own observation, going through the schools and seeing how well they are maintained, the grounds, the exteriors, the interiors. So kudos to the staff for keeping the schools up. There's a considerable range in the condition of the facilities as measured by the FCI. The average FCI is about 31%, with the best FCI at the Gateway School of about 3.8%, and the worst FCI at Westminster East Middle School at 78.7%. So that's a very great range, and that does indicate the need to address the schools with the highest FCI. There is a significant need to upgrade the facilities and the building systems. Total value of the systems that are past for useful life is estimated at $390 million, a very large figure. And the current CIP, which you just heard, and that actually updates some of the information that you have in front of you on this presentation, as well as in the report, the total of $25.4 million is heartening, and the average for the next 5 years would be $33.2 million by my estimation. But it does indicate there is a great need for capital investment. The committee came to 3 basic findings from its own deliberations and from what it heard from the community. First of all, East Middle School. If this facility is an unavoidable driver of all planning decisions, it simply cannot be avoided. You're very familiar with this. The building systems are past for useful life. This HVAC, roof, electrical, fire alarm, and windows have been identified by the staff as the systems that need attention. There are significant educational deficiencies. The building is not compliant with Americans with Disabilities Act requirements, and the BEST program is in inappropriate space. There was a great deal that needs to be done to this facility. The options, in a way, are extremely simple. They lay out, you either close this facility and then have to think about relocating, redistricting the students. And the risk committee has developed 4 options that looked at that, and all of these were rejected because of the implications, which we can talk about later if you like. The other clear option is you improve the existing facility in some form or other, and there you're always going to be dealing with a very expensive project, even at the very, very low end of what needs to be done. And it increases to a very large figure if you're talking about full modernization. But it's simply unavoidable that at some point you're going to have to address this condition. The second finding very much relates to the name of the committee, the Redistricting and School Closure Committee. And we talked about this a great number of times at the meetings, going back to the very beginning when we met. And there were two questions that came up again and again and again. What is the compelling need for either redistricting or for closure? What are the drivers that would insist on these actions? And what would be achieved by either redistricting or school closure? And the simple answer is that we couldn't answer the question. That if you go to redistricting, there at the moment is no compelling current argument for redistricting. The usual factors that drive a need for redistricting, that give urgency to it, where you have severe inequities between schools in either the condition of the facilities or in the utilization. And then a second would be where you have obvious illogical student assignments, leading to, say, feeder patterns that are simply illogical and need to be corrected. We don't see that in Carroll County Public Schools. That's not to say that there aren't the variances, as I mentioned before, between FCI from the lowest to the highest, and there certainly are feeder problems, but whether those justify comprehensive redistricting is a school in the future, and South Carroll High School, and you could also look at Francis Scott Key High School 5 years out in terms of utilization. You certainly will have spot problems that need to be looked at. You have a process in place, an annual review process that does address those, and through that process, recommendations should come forward for spot redistricting. But I don't see, we as a committee don't see any need for a comprehensive redistricting. It's unclear whether there really would be operational efficiencies or cost savings through redistricting. Transportation would be the area where you would look for the primary savings in terms of the greater efficiencies in the routing, the time on the road. You would have to actually map multiple options in order to find out and do a detailed analysis to find out if there were going to be any savings or not. In our discussions, back and forth, for every advantage that was presented, it was also possible to see the possibility of disadvantages that could actually increase the cost for redistricting. And without this detailed analysis, you simply will not know. There are potential detriments that could result in increased travel distances and ride times for students, and then a basic factor of the disruption of the communities. We think, however, that this should be looked at in the future. There could be conditions that will emerge where student enrollments could change. The facility utilization factors may develop differently than the projections that are shown now. This has to be looked at least an annual basis, and that might justify in the future redistricting. Our option 4, in fact, is oriented towards that possibility. In any case, the goals have to be clearly articulated. The factors are very complex, and they may conflict with one another. The desire to equalize utilization across the district may actually lead to illogical feeder patterns. And you have seen that in other jurisdictions where the desire to provide full enrollment at one high school has led to a situation where the boundary of that high school goes literally to 1 block away from the adjacent high school. You can imagine what that means in terms of family life and friends and how the people feel who have invested in a home. In any redistricting plan, it's very important to minimize the impact on students with special needs. That has to be taken into account. And I think the board directive to look carefully at all the special programs does take that into account, and we were certainly cognizant of that in our discussions. A similar discussion about school closure. There's no compelling current argument for school closure, driven by the usual factor. For instance, a school which is in such bad condition that it creates hazardous conditions and really should be closed, a school which is operating at a gross level of inefficiency because of under-enrollment. We don't see that in Carroll County Public Schools. The operational savings from closure are very definite. You would save money through reduction of utility costs and reduction of maintenance costs. On the other hand, there would be offsets as well, which are very hard to estimate. Increased transportation distances and ride times for students, not only the ride times, but also the costs associated with transportation, potentially new staffing needs, and the potential that you would have to do renovations or make other changes at schools that receive students. And until you actually identify a school for closure, you won't know what these costs are. There are potential detriments. In a situation where the enrollments are stabilizing, and there does look like some potential for possible growth, I think, and the committee believes, that you need to retain flexibility. Close the school now, and 5, 7, 10 years down the road, come to regret it significantly because now you don't have a facility and enrollments have grown. Other detriments, the increase in student travel times and distances, obviously, and the disruption of communities. Closure should be considered only if there's unambiguous evidence that the facility is significantly underutilized, is in very poor condition, or is extremely costly to operate, or if a closure would benefit other schools by increasing, say, the enrollment to acceptable levels or desired levels, and again, minimizing the impact on students with special needs. A third basic finding is that the facilities have been underfunded. As mentioned before in the discussion, the annual investment required to maintain the current FCI would be about $44.4 million per year. To improve the FCI by 10% would be an investment annually of $55 million per year. Those are current dollars. The annual average capital expenditure for FY 2010 through 2009 was $13.2 million. Now, those are actual dollars, not corrected for construction cost escalation. The actual value would be higher if you took into account construction cost escalation. But the gap would still be very apparent. The order of magnitude would still be very large, and it indicates that there has been underinvestment in the facilities. Something, if you use these figures, 30% to 25% to 30% underinvestment in terms of maintaining current FCI. The figures that were shown before by Mr. Kane are heartening because they show that there would be, if it was fully funded, increased investment, but it doesn't reach the level that's indicated by maintaining or improving the FCI. And of course, the consequences of underinvestment, I think you all are aware of: building performance, increased maintenance costs, increased risk of system failure. If you hear about HVAC systems that are operating beyond 30 years, you're running risks there that a system won't operate properly, and simply lack of efficiency, underperforming, energy inefficient systems, and also roofs that leak, flooding, and so forth. And educational impacts. The educational setting is not supportive of education. It might actually be hampering the delivery of the educational program. The basic misalignment between the educational programs and the facility, as we heard about in the pre-kindergarten discussion before, barriers to disabled students and to others through non-compliance with ADA, and potential indoor air quality problems that we're all extremely concerned about these days in terms of potential respiratory impacts on sensitive building occupants. So the third area I'd like to talk about is the planning process itself. From the very beginning, the Risk Committee wanted to understand what it was doing, why it had been formed, and what its purpose was. And so it developed a mission statement. And it states simply, to recommend options that are consistent with a stable facility management process that supports, first, instructional excellence, second, high-quality, modern, and equitable school facilities, third, operational efficiencies, and four, flexibility to respond to changes in enrollments and demographics without loss of educational quality. Four of the options that are presented for you do reflect these points, with the possible exception of the third point, the operational efficiencies, where we're not certain. one of the options could result in operational efficiencies if that were the goal of redistricting. The committee felt that it was very important, given the consequences of the options to be presented and the actions that would be taken based on those options, that the process itself be very careful, very deliberative, and that it promote a maximum of objectivity. And so there was basically a 6-step process with some overlap between the steps. Information gathering, 2 evenings, actually it was more than 2 evenings, in which there were presentations on a variety of subjects having to do with the school system, as well as on the county in general. The 2 subcommittees were formed to undertake research, an educational models and grade configuration subcommittee to look at the current programs and to also consider grade configuration models, and then a school boundaries and closures subcommittee that examined the potential for closure of facilities. Third, there was a community outreach period. We had 2 listening sessions in the North County, the South County, end of April and end of May. There were also emails that were received, and there were a number of those were responded to, and there were other inputs from the community. There was a development of planning objectives, which emerged from the discussions of the community, of the committee rather, identifying the planning objectives and seeing how they aligned with the goals, the parameters, and the considerations that had been developed by the board and presented to the committee in March. And then a total of 11 planning options were examined and were discussed thoroughly. And through the process of evaluation and prioritization, they were reduced to the 5 options that I'll be talking about this evening. The planning objectives themselves were extremely important. And the weighting of each of these objectives is based on a very simple fact. The mission of the school system is to educate children. And so to the extent that a planning objective supports and aligns with that basic mission of the school system, it was given the highest weighting, and then lesser weightings indicate less of a relationship to the fundamental mission. So the first 3, the functional setting for educational programs, the condition of school buildings, and the operating expenses have a very clear relationship to education itself in terms of either the physical setting where education takes place or the resources for the operating budget that can be directed to education. Each of those was given a weighting of 3. Existing communities are very important in terms of the support they give to schools and the role the school has in the existing community, but somewhat more distant from the direct mission of the school system. And similarly with feeder patterns. They certainly affect education and they affect extracurricular activities, students' time, but they're somewhat more removed from the basic mission. And economic development, you could say the same thing. Ride times were very important in terms of the ability of students to focus on schoolwork and to have the time for it. So that was the result. There was ample discussion about the weighting, a good deal of back and forth to arrive at appropriate weightings. The methodology used for prioritizing the 11 options, the committee was divided up into teams of 2. There were 7 committees with some help from the staff. Each team was assigned one of the planning objectives, and then each of these 2-member teams analyzed the impact of each of the 11 options on their particular planning objective, and then reported out to the committee. We used a trinary approach. Basically, that if there was a positive impact perceived from one of the planning options for that particular objective, it received the full weighting. So if the weighting was a 3, it received the full 3. If it was negative, it received a full -3. If it was uncertain or if it was believed there was no impact, it received a 0. The teams reported their conclusions to the entire committee. There was a great deal of discussion about the results of this, and then consensus was reached on the results. The weightings were summed, and the total scores led to the 11 planning options being reduced to 5 in priority order. This was a kind of a screening tool, and the instrument we used is this, which I'm sure the committee members never want to see again as long as they live, because we spent so much time talking about it and going through it in detail. But it does show in the right-hand column the results of this summing process. It was meant to, as I said, promote objectivity in the results, but allowing for full discussion about each of the options. And the 5 options are listed here in priority order. In the interest of time, I'll simply move on to the next step, which is to talk about the budget implications. With the operating budget implication, you're familiar with the factors that can lead to savings: transportation, utilities, staffing, maintenance, and then educational and administrative staffing, as well as the facility maintenance staffing. 4 of the 5 options that we presented involve little or no redistricting. There would be some impacts on transportation, but we don't know what the impacts would be on staffing. And that would depend on the types of educational programs that are proposed. For instance, the first priority is the K-8 facility, but until there's an educational specification that defines how it's going to be administered, is this going to be one administration? Will it be 2 administrations? Will it be 2 facilities, or will it be 1 facility? These are choices that have to be made, and it's only through an educational specification process that you arrive at those decisions. Without those decisions, you simply don't know what your staffing requirements are going to be. So we could not address that kind of factor. One of the options may involve extensive redistricting, but this would require very extensive staff time. It's a relatively lower priority in the list of 5. There was a great hesitation about committing the staff, particularly at this time of year, to examining alternative options for redistricting when, in fact, the committee as a whole did not feel that redistricting was warranted. This did not seem like an appropriate use of staff time, and we do have some figures on how much staff time would be required for this. The goals that would be required to be enunciated in order to really guide a redistricting process are major policy decisions which the Board of Education has to go through the deliberative process to arrive at to give guidance. So the result of this is that the Risk Committee does not provide operational costs for the options. It can provide capital costs with some degree of reliability. Options 1 and 2 do allow for reasonable estimates to be developed. Option 3 allows a range of estimates to be developed. The costs include the usual things you're familiar with: the building costs, site costs, construction contingency, project development costs, which are usually called soft costs, phasing premium, a factor which is often overlooked. If you're working in an occupied building, it can add anywhere from 15 to 25% to the basic construction costs simply through the actions that are required for phasing of the work. And then demolition, if any of the projects require demolition of, say, existing East Middle School, that itself is a cost that has to be factored in. Costs are projected to the start of construction using 4% per year construction cost escalation. It's a compounded figure. That figure could be way off. The market is in great flux right now because of activity that's happening in Baltimore City, because of the potential impact of the tariffs and the effect that they may have on metals particularly. We don't know what the outcome is. So we're looking for an annual report that will come out from various sources, Gilbane Construction, for instance, and hopefully that'll give better guidance. There are many factors that can affect future costs. The scope itself, unforeseen conditions in soils and behind the walls for renovation work, the location and site conditions, market conditions at the time of bid, and delays can also affect. We have assumed in developing these costs that the projects would start as soon as reasonably possible, but that does mean that it's very likely there would be overlap in construction with the Career Tech Center construction. If that's not possible because of funding constraints, then the projects that we're talking about would have to be pushed out by a number of years, and because of construction cost escalation, these figures that we're offering would have to be readjusted. Within these limitations, the figures are fairly reliable. And so to talk about the options themselves through this process, first of all, as the highest priority, the most desirable would be simply a K-8 replacement facility. Closing East Middle School and closing William Winchester Elementary School, relocating the students into a new replacement facility. Call it a campus because it's not clear whether it be one facility or 2 facilities. The site would be in the Westminster area. It'd be either near the existing site or it'd be on the actual site. This project would be state-of-the-art. It would meet all the educational requirements. It would be a high-performance building. It would include the BEST program. It would be, in effect, an elementary and middle school combination, because if it's a simple replacement for what's there, the middle school is actually receiving elementary school students from 6 elementary schools, 5 in addition to William Winchester. So this is not the usual K-8 model that you might say find in Baltimore City right now, where a certain number of elementary school students matriculate through as a class to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It would be an elementary middle model, rather. There are many benefits, obviously, to having a high-efficiency, state-of-the-art facility, and it would also offer the opportunity through the ed-spec process and the design process to include other educational programs, special programs, as well as community use as a benefit to the community. There are significant detriments. The high cost, obviously, is one of them. Finding a site could be difficult. If the East Middle School site is used, this is actually outside the William Winchester attendance area, so some redistricting would be required. There's also the Longwell Street, or Longwell Avenue, I can't remember which it is, problem, the parking lot being on the other side of a city street, and that isn't easily overcome except by closure of the street or redirecting the street. So there would have to be interaction with the city over that particular issue if the EMS site is used. There would also be the cost to the county to maintain the existing building and dispose of it if another site is used, or there would be the cost to demolish and repurpose William Winchester facility as well. Of course, if it were demolished, that would be a benefit to the entire site, which is extremely constrained for parking as it is now, partly because of the topography on the site. This is not an inexpensive project. We're estimating $88.3 million, inclusive of the demolition of existing middle school, estimating the demolition at about $1 million, including the disposal fees and so forth. So if it were a different site, you could reduce that by, say, $1 million. Opening, if everything started now and moved forward very smoothly, opening in summer of 2023. Second option would be full modernization of East Middle School, and using the word modernization in the way that it's being used by Carroll County Public Schools. This means either replacement of the existing facility or full renovation. Either case, you arrive at a state-of-the-art facility. With renovation, there would undoubtedly be some constraints. There are certain structural aspects to East Middle School that you could not overcome even through renovation, but it would meet all high-performance requirements in terms of building systems. It would meet ADA accessibility requirements. It would involve extensive reconfiguration of the instructional spaces to bring them up to current standards. Renovation would have the advantage of retaining the existing facade, and I think by showing it in the first slide, I've given away my own, sort of liking for that facade and my admiration for it. And the functional and symbolic function of the facility in the existing site would be retained through either replacement or through renovation. However, by this process, this very large process, you could also re-examine the feeder patterns and the boundaries, and you could also, just as with the K-8, include other educational programs or community uses. Again, the detriments are similar, very large capital costs, and for the renovation, the phasing costs, because as far as we know, you could not relocate all of the students to another facility, and it's very unlikely that you could place enough relocatable classrooms on that particular site while still having access to the fields and for the access requirements for vehicles to be able to house all the students in a temporary facility while construction was going on. So some phasing would be required. You could achieve ADA compliance, but you would still have the stairwell at the opening of a school where you first come into it. That is deeply structural. You're not going to get away from that. The capital cost is large, and it might be surprising to you to see that the replacement cost, we're estimating at $58.2 million, is less than the full renovation cost at $63.4. That reflects the influence of the phasing. It drives up the cost significantly. And again, the school opening, best case, summer of 2023. The next option is limited improvements to the existing building, and this represents a range of improvements from the low end of simply replacing building systems, correcting some ADA of the problems that you need to and probably would be required as a condition of permit, all the way up to what was called by the state limited renovation possibility. Their benefits are that the scope can be tailored to the available budget and to the schedule. You can retain many aspects of the building. In fact, you probably would work within the existing footprint. The possibility of an addition shouldn't be ruled out, might be necessary for programmatic reasons. It would not result in a like-new facility, as modernization, either as replacement or as full renovation, would result in a like-new building that would meet all educational performance requirements. With this option, you would not meet all educational and performance requirements. It would still be a very large capital outlay. Phasing would be required. The scope would be restricted. That can lead to dissatisfaction. It becomes an issue. Where do you put the money? And I've seen a number of these projects carried out, and where you see the improvements, they are excellent. But then choices had to be made, and where things had to be skipped over or only done in part, it's very glaring. And part of what makes it glaring is the contrast between what's new and what has to be retained. So that is a potential detriment. We think the low range of capital costs is about $35.6 million, very, very large, and that's simply to replace the HVAC, the electrical, the 5 systems that I mentioned before. The high range, about $5 million more, would be for the limited renovation. The state definition of limited renovation is 5 major systems and building-wide architectural and educational improvements, but not every space is touched. The costs here were developed by looking at limited renovations from 2 other school systems that have carried out these projects successfully, St. Mary's County and Baltimore County, and then taking their cost per square foot figure and some discussion, increasing it for Carroll County. Again, school opening, best case, summer of 2023. That's for the high range. For the low range, it would depend on the scope that's adopted. And with the phasing, working over the summers, some work would have to be done during the school year, but we think that at least 2 summers would be required. The fourth option is comprehensive redistricting without school closure. This would involve a countywide study of student assignments to meet the goals that would be established by the Board of Education. The assumptions are that it would be warranted by future conditions, by utilization, building condition, educational requirements. The committee does not believe it's warranted now, as I said, but it could be warranted, and keeping an eye on the enrollments and the utilizations would possibly trigger this. The goals that could be established to guide this: balancing school utilizations, balancing the course offerings and sections at high schools, improving the feeder patterns, improving the operating budget, ride times for students, fiscal and operational efficiencies. And I've mentioned before, some of these are in conflict with one another, and that's why these are actually policy decisions that would have to be made by the board. The benefits: the study itself would test whether the assumptions of the board and the goals that were established can be met. If they can be met, then presumably that factor would be improved. The detriments, as I've mentioned: disruption to the current attendance patterns in communities, and it may require capital investment. We don't know what the capital costs would be, obviously, until certain options are developed for redistricting, and the school opening dates would obviously remain unchanged. They could, if capital investments were involved, there would be some changes possibly in school opening dates. And then the final option is targeted improvements to existing facilities. This would be an incremental program where the amount of investment that would be made each year would be determined really by what is possible within the budget. It would involve a study that would look at all the special programs across the county, would determine that through an ed spec process their facility requirements, engage a third-party consultant to come in and examine each of the spaces that the special programs occupy, determine if they meet the educational facility requirements, what needs to be done to correct deficiencies, and then a process of prioritization based on budgeting and schedule to establish a schedule, which could stretch across 10 years or even more, of step by step improving these spaces. The improvements would assist a large number of students, but they certainly wouldn't assist all the students in the school system. They'd probably do very little, something, but very little to assist the overall FCI of the school system. They would not affect the utilizations in most cases. Most of these improvements could be made within the existing walls of the facilities. Additions might be needed in some cases, likely to be small. The capital costs are unknown because the program itself has to be established, but most likely, if a budget figure were established, then working backwards, you would determine how much work could be done within that budget figure, and that would lead to the scope definition and the prioritization of the projects. And so, just to wrap this up, this committee has not found that there's a rationale for redistricting or closure at this time. There is a need for an increase of capital investment, and East Middle School simply has to be addressed. I'd be happy to take any questions you have, and I'm sure the members of the committee are here, and they might be interested in participating. So, interested in hearing what your questions might be about this.
Ms.
Can we
Herbert?
just thank first?
Oh,
Can
yes.
we thank the committee for this incredible work that they've done?
Yeah,
Dr. Lever, I want to thank you. Thank you all. You all caught me at Winter's Mill one day and I ran out, so I wouldn't be involved. But I do have to say something. Don and I were newbies on this committee, on this membership. And we sat down for days and we did work out a plan. And we presented it. And it was to do a K through 8 and either on Friendship Valley or this middle school where it is now, and also to redistrict. So I don't think, Ms. Savigny, we were not too far off. So, and I want to thank you so much. I really thank you for your time, because a lot of common sense, a lot of hours, and a lot of thinking deeply about what ifs and all that. And I thank you very much, because it was very mind-opening. Thank you.
Commissioner Howard.
Well, first of all, I also want to express appreciation for the work that was done. I think it's been a tremendous amount of effort on your part. I hesitate to say what I'm about to say, but I need to say it anyhow. I feel like you were given an impossible task, because I believe, and I expressed some of these concerns earlier on, that this board, our Board of Education, did not give enough direction for you to come up with meaningful results other than things that we already knew. Knowing that East Middle is a problem is something we knew. Knowing that we need more capital if we're going to meet the needs of the existing facilities, we already knew. And at the end of the day, I think after all of this, we end up with very, very good information if someone's willing to take action. I just don't know who's willing to take action. So I have a couple of questions. One is, if we knew that the average that we've put into capital over the budget of the next 5 or 10 years was going to be $25 million a year, not 44, not 55, but $25 million a year. If that was all that could be done, would the conclusion of the board or the committee that there's not a compelling reason to look at the number of facilities we have and make an adjustment be different? That's one. The second is, when I look at where growth is happening, and in our county we have designated growth areas. We don't look at the county as a whole, and I know you're looking at utilization here school by school. But long-term, we have designated growth areas where the state puts all of its money, we put our infrastructure money, it's municipalities, it's the Freedom area. You might have heard we've had some consternation down there in discussing planning, so I've got a lot of very recent discussions about planning. And the reality is, we're already overgrown in the areas where we're expecting to grow even more. And so I don't understand how, and I know the term up there was severe inequities. I don't want to wait until there are severe inequities to put a plan in place for the community to do what it needs to do. A lot of times when we deal with traffic issues, we'll hear from State Highway that if we haven't had a fatality at an intersection, it doesn't justify taking action. I think that's a very wrong way of looking at long-term planning for a community. So I don't want to wait until there are severe inequities. If we know that we're already overcrowded or moving in that direction, or utilization's much higher in the areas where we have growth designated, not just for now, but for the long-term future, how could it not benefit us to look at redistricting to build the capacity where we're going to need it? And lastly, I guess I look at it and say, it's very easy for us sometimes to look at the capital budget and the operating budget as separate, that they have nothing to do with each other. I've had people tell me that for 8 years. However, every time we put a dollar into the capital budget, there's some element of the operating budget that goes to debt service. If our number one objection and our number one mission is to educate our children and achieve instructional excellence, and to me the biggest obstacle of that is our ability to stay competitive in terms of compensation, I don't understand how we can make a huge step forward in terms of capital going into buildings, because it's not the buildings that teach. Now, better buildings are great, but I'll take a better teacher over a better building any day.
Commissioner Howard, could you wrap this up, please?
Sure. So I
We have a
guess-
long board meeting.
Okay, well, you didn't think it was a lack of time when you talked about where I spent my summer vacation. But if this is too much time, I
excuse me.
apologize.
No, Commissioner,
But my question is,
Mr. Commissioner Howard, right now, he asked for questions.
okay, so, well, I asked one. The other
you-
question
that
is,
was an-
with those considerations, would there be different conclusions that could be drawn?
Okay. For that one, you're saying if you
reasonable question.
could allocate 25 million per year.
Right.
Okay, now I think the conclusion that you'd have to draw from that is that the FCI would decline. You would not be maintaining the current FCI, which means the condition of the facilities as a whole would tend to decline, and probably the condition of the facilities that are already at the low end of FCI would be the ones that would feel the impact most, because they are the most costly to maintain, the most difficult to maintain in operating conditions. So that would have to be a consequence accepted. I think the assumption behind the question is that if the committee re-examined this based on that parameter, 25 million per year, and said that forces us to close a school, to recommend a school for closure, would there be savings enough in terms of the operating budget, which I agree would go both into operations and into debt service for the capital. They are not separated, and I agree completely with that. So it could support additional capital projects to help to stabilize the FCI. And the problem that we have is, as a committee, is not knowing if the offsets might be so large that they would actually erode some of those advantages. We simply don't know, because with a closure, and here's where it might be useful to look at some of the maps. This one shows if East Middle School closed. This student allocation methodology basically looks at the school. I'm sure you've seen this kind of map before. Mm-hmm. The school which is closest as the crow flies from the other schools. And I think what you see here, there's a pointer. Let me get that. There we go. There it is. Okay. You can see that the distances for Northeast Middle would increase significantly, and for Northwest would also increase significantly. You'd see some increases for Shiloh. This isn't the same as an actual road map and a student assignment map, but it gives an idea that there would be impacts. And because of that, I think it's reasonable to say that travel distance, bus routes, ride times would also increase, and there would be costs associated with that, which would tend to offset the savings in terms of utilities and in maintenance by closing a school. Whether there would be staff savings or not is a whole other question, which I don't think we'd be in a position to answer. Many staff would simply be transferred, instructional staff. There might be some staff savings in terms of, say, the operations, determined. So that, I think we just can't answer that. Conceptually, you can say it's a real problem. We'd have to study that, and a group would have to study that very closely. Would you like me to address those other two issues? I don't know if they weren't presented as questions, but I'd be glad to comment on them.
Well,
I think maybe we need to have some board members weigh in here, because I'm not sure that everyone is agreeing with your pontification, Commissioner Howard. Well, no, it's a big, okay. while teachers teach, and of course they are the most important things, if and when East Middle fails and we have 700 kids that don't have a place to be, and we have however many teachers are there that don't have a place to teach, that becomes a significant problem. And I recognize the commissioners don't want to touch this, but you're going to have to. Something has to be done about East Middle unless you want to be in the same exact situation that we were with Charles Carroll, which failed and we had to close that school. You guys are now spending almost the same amount of money to build a community center up there when we had asked for years and years and years to do what needed to be done for our school. The prior Board of Education, it is true, the prior Board of Education went to the commissioners and asked for a K through 8 to deal with Charles Carroll, William Winchester, and East Middle. We did that before any school closures were considered. Your board voted 5-0 not to do that. The back committee, that was their #1 recommendation. We have board members here who have come up with that as their #1 recommendation, and we have an entire panel of people who have no interest other than doing what is best for this county, who have come to the same exact conclusion.
Which would be
Now-
great if money was no issue, but it's an issue.
Well, then this needs to become a priority. I don't know what you expect to happen. You can't leave East Middle there unattended. There is 0 other options. Something has to be done with East Middle. Now, we can choose as a community to ignore it until we have 700 kids that have no school to go to. And then 100% capacity and 75 kids still unassigned.
Does Ms. Rothschild have to ask a question, or is she allowed to pontificate?
I'm sorry, I think she's giving a board member's opinion,
Okay.
and I think that needs to be tempered here, Commissioner.
So I think that I wanted to start, Commissioner Howard got me sidetracked here, but because it's very unresponsible for this Board of Commissioners to not do something about East. What I really wanted to say was I am so impressed by the work of this committee in such a short period of time. I have never read a report as detailed as this. I have, you guys volunteered for this, which was very brave because you didn't know what the recommendation was going to be, and it could have been to close the school in your own community. So I just am so incredibly grateful for the work that you guys put into this, for the amount of detail, and I just am so thankful for everything that you have done.
As am I.
Answer the question, because I think actually.
No, I'm sorry, no, you're out of order.
I'm on the committee, so I was just.
I know, but you're out of order right now, please. Yeah.
Ms. Herbert.
Mr. Howard, I'd appreciate if you did not throw the Board of Education under the bus, and we are so highly paid, we're like volunteers, and I don't appreciate your first comment you made.
Well, there have been many made the other way towards the Board of Commissioners. That's not the point. The
Point of order. We have questions for Dr. Lever.
Okay.
Board members, any other questions? No, I would like to make remarks. Thank you to the committee for all your hard work. I do have a couple of questions. It indicated that there was early on that a proposal of possibly doing more in-depth research. Can you elaborate on what that might have been?
Well, the subcommittees did conduct research. The educational subcommittee looked at existing programs. They visited a total of 8 schools, 4 elementary, 2 middle, 2 high schools, to look at the educational programs. They developed a report, which is one of the appendices of the full report that you have in front of you. And from that, they did determine, then by talking to administrators, by their own observations, that there was a need. There's a need to address those special programs, that some of them are in spaces that are inappropriate, spaces that are too small, that need to have additional spaces, additional facilities. This was not looking at every program in the school system. It was what was available within the time that they could commit to this, but still it's a substantial tour. It suggested to the committee as a whole that there's a need to do a systematic review of all of the special programs across the school system and determine their facility requirements. Now, this is under the assumption that the existing staffing is adequate. The question came up again and again, what are the enrollment projections in the special programs? And does that imply that there's a need to either look at new programs or to expand existing programs? The committee decided that that was outside of its purview. That was really an educational matter, but something that we would note, which we did note in a section towards the end of the report. But that does not take away the need to do this assessment on a system-wide basis to see what the facility needs are. That was one component of the research of that subcommittee. The second component was looking at the grade configuration issue, and they looked at the literature. The literature seemed to indicate that there were no particular academic advantages to any specific model that could be presented. That it really depends on so many other factors, the leadership, the faculty, the community support that's given to any specific model, and that it is a major shift of policy to move from one model, the model that you already have in place, to a different model, unless there are very clear, unassailable evidence that a model works better in a particular situation, then you shouldn't make that. School systems that have done this, I'm familiar with Baltimore City, for instance, did it because they were extremely concerned about the transition between elementary school and middle school, or between middle school and high school, and they established K-8s, which are true K-8s, as I said before, matriculation of the same elementary class through the middle school, or they established grades 6 through 12. And frankly, I don't know how well those are working in practice. So that was another dimension, and we have provided you with a set of references to literature that was looked at. A third dimension they looked at was distance learning, remote learning, online learning, and the conclusions were that there are no particular advantages to that. In fact, there are a lot of detriments that seem to be emerging. There are some models from around the United States. Washington State in particular has an online school district now, has had that in place for over a decade. But it's a very different situation than Carroll County. You know, it has immensely remote, low population areas where probably the only access that a household can have to education, short of a very, very long bus ride, is through online. You don't have that in Carroll County, but it's something that the door should be kept open to examine that in the future. Then on the other side, we have the School Boundaries and Closure Committee, and they went through an extremely rigorous process of looking at schools using the parameters, we've outlined this in the full report, to see if there were any schools that, if they were closed, would help the school system to meet the board's parameters for utilization, which had been outlined on March 7th in the document that we were provided. And they did find that the closure of 1 or 2 elementary schools would lead to falling within those parameters, that closing 1 middle school would not help to meet those parameters, and the situation was ambiguous in terms of high school. Now, that's just looking at cold numbers. That's not looking at the real on-the-ground implications of what it means to close a school. When you start to look at that, the real on-the-ground implications, closing a high school anywhere in the county, it would be so dramatic. It would have such an immense impact on other high schools in terms of the redistricting of students, likely in terms of utilization, likely in terms of staffing and the educational programs, that you would have to, the committee shied away from that altogether. We do have a slide that shows closure of Winter Mill High School. Which slide is that? Here we go. It's the last one in the presentation. If Winter Mill was closed, the implications in terms of the impact it could have on other high schools. You can see here for Francis Scott Key, ride times extending well into the current district for Winters Mill, Westminster High School extending into the same area, Manchester Valley also extending somewhat. You know, so you can see that the implications would actually be county-wide. Middle school, you find similar implications. And so through this rigorous process in identifying an elementary school, the only elementary school that emerged was Sandymount Elementary School, but that was rejected because that was also looked at in terms of the implications. And we do have the slides that show that. Go back here. There we go. The close-up, I think, gives a very good idea of what the impacts would be, closing Sandy Mount, on adjacent elementary schools and potential increases of ride time. And look at this, we're looking at a doubling of the distance to the, from the current edge of the attendance area to potentially where a student would live who would have to attend the school. See, and based on that and the kind of unknowns and the fact that there aren't these discrepancies in utilization or condition that sort of drive towards the need to close schools. And I've seen this in other jurisdictions in the state where there were conditions, either a physical condition or a utilization situation that was so dire that it actually demanded closure of the school and consolidation. 2 high schools in Allegheny County, each of them operating well below utilization. They could not provide the full educational program in either of these 2 high schools, consolidate them, and they both were in pretty bad facilities. One of them was much better than the other. One of them was absolutely deplorable. Consolidate those 2, have a full student body, something about 1,000 students, and begin to provide a full educational program. As I understand it, the students are absolutely delighted by it, and the only objection was the fact that the 2 football teams would now be consolidated into a single football team, which was a very
Yes.
serious issue. It almost stopped the project. But
Yes.
the outcome has been very good. Now, ride times for many students did increase because of that. Not by a huge factor, but they did increase. But the benefit of going to a state-of-the-art facility where they can participate in band, they can be in the concert, in the marching band, in the football team, and so forth, all this outweighed all those objections. So the outcome of this was that supported the idea that really we weren't recommending, the committee was not recommending any school closure at this point. It was a very thorough, rigorous process, and Mr. Prokop could speak about that if you'd like to know more detail, but it's all in the report, too.
No, thank you. In fact, the report, I've never seen a report so detailed in plain English.
Oh, well,
I mean,
We can understand.
we had to work at
something
that, I can tell you.
that everybody can understand by reading it. Anyone in the public can have a very, just the acronyms, that there are definitions for all the acronyms. I thought it was a phenomenal job. Board members, are there any other questions? Dr. Lockhart, I know you want to say something.
Thank you. Again, I want to thank Dr. Lever and the committee members for their dedication and the report, and the thoroughness that you mentioned is very obvious. Gives us a lot to think about. For the public, just so you know, we'll have the presentation, the full report, the executive summary, all that will be available first thing tomorrow morning on the website. In terms of going forward, obviously, prior to me getting here, I had time to look at all the events that led up to the process.
Tonight.
Oh, it's on tonight? Okay, thank you. I'll go back. Thank you, Ms. Herbert. The presentation, the report, the executive summary will be up tonight after the meeting on the website. Okay. Going forward, like I said, I've had time to review a lot of those events that led up to the formation of the risk committee, and have certainly recognized that the process the board determined when they formed that committee back in February was that the report would be received tonight, just like it was, that I'm going to need some time to digest, and along with the rest of us, digest all that information to come back for a possible recommendation to the board in October. And then the timeline from there would be that the board would review that recommendation and potentially take action upon that at a future board meeting. I also recognize the timing of all this is significant in that with beginning tonight, we're working toward our capital improvement budget. And we talked a little bit about many of the options have some potential impact on our CIP. Therefore, I think that timeline's important as it allows us to start to incorporate any future action into the CIP if needed. So with that in mind, and acknowledging that there's clearly a lot here for us and the public to digest, I'd like to begin by opening up some different options for the public to provide feedback. I think it's really important. The committee did a great job of incorporating that feedback. I also would like to take the opportunity to allow the public to give some feedback on what was presented this evening. So, Ms. Gaddis, when that report gets posted this evening, I believe we're going to include information on how the public can submit comments to myself and to the board about the report and the options presented. Certainly, citizens are welcome to send us emails or use the U.S. mail if they'd like. Additionally, we've thought a little bit about, because of that brief turnaround here, we've preliminarily scheduled a public forum to engage citizens on the risk report. And so we're holding the evening of October 1st at 7 p.m. at Winters Mill High School to allow the public and any interested community to come ask questions, give their input, give their feedback. Dr. Lever has also verified his availability on that evening in terms of a lot of the logistics and the specifics. It would certainly be valuable to have you on hand. And so unless there's additional discussion, I think that's like how I'd like to recommend that we proceed. And again, I just want to express my appreciation to Dr. Lever and the entire committee for their work.
So, actually, I have a comment. Would the board have a desire to not ask the committee to disband just yet? In case, as we get feedback and everything, we might have a couple other tweaks. I mean, we aren't asking you to remain in this room until then, and we appreciate everything you've done. It's just that we don't want you to be considered done just yet until we start getting a little feedback. We might ask you to look at something a little bit differently. So do we have consensus from this board with, Ms. Rothschild not being here? Okay, well, thank you
They're
again.
not looking thrilled about that.
I was gonna say, I think we need consensus from them.
Yeah. Do we have your consensus? But thank you again. I would like to, thank you, Dr. Lever. I'd like to propose a 15-minute recess.
10 minutes?
We will, we'll return it.
I'm telling you, 9:30 is better than mine.